Welcome, everyone, to the 7th Annual ETE Conference. We're so excited to have you here. Our virtual format this year allows us to include everyone in the conference wherever you are, and we're excited for that opportunity. I want to introduce real fast Marilyn Cuch.
Good morning, Travis. Welcome to the 7th Annual Empowering Teaching Excellence Virtual Conference. Our theme for the conference and this year is Empowering Accessible and Inclusive Learning. We are so excited to have over 550 participants from across the state of Utah, U.S., and internationally. I'm Marilyn Cuch, co-chair of the ETE conference and a lecturer in the School of Teacher Education and Leadership. Today, I'm joining the conference from the Uinta Basin campus in Roosevelt. Before we get started, we would like to acknowledge that our USU campuses and learning take place on the traditional lands of the Dene, Goshute, Paiute, Shoshone, and Ute peoples past and present, and honor the land itself and the people who have stewarded it throughout the generations. Thank you, and please enjoy the exciting and inspiring day we've coordinated for you. I will turn it over to Dr. Robert Wagner.
Thank you very much, Travis and Marilyn. I really appreciate the opportunity to welcome you all to this conference. It's a little bittersweet. This is the 7th annual ETE conference, and I've grown to love and appreciate the opportunity of greeting you all, welcoming you in person in the Taggart Student Center ballroom here on the Utah State University Logan campus. I miss being able to see your smiling faces and to feel the energy as we approach the start of fall semester. Know that I miss that opportunity. I'm grateful for you all and the wonderful job that you do. I also, though, am excited about the fact that this virtual conference gives us the opportunity to welcome faculty and colleagues from across the state of Utah, outside of Utah State University, across our country, as well as international. On behalf of Utah State University's administration, I welcome you to this conference and welcome you virtually to Utah State University, where teaching excellence is something very important to us, and it's an emphasis and a goal and a focus in what we do here at our institution and across the state as part of the land grant mission that we have. What an interesting time to be teaching in higher education. I've been thinking lately about this summer and all the preparations that we've all been involved in, preparing for a very different fall semester for whatever institution or whatever campus you teach at. It's going to be a different fall, and we've all been working very hard, and I want to recognize the work of you faculty, the fantastic jobs that you have been doing in preparing to teach in very creative and in most cases different ways than what you had originally anticipated teaching. It's made me think about the term resilience and how we as faculty, as staff, and especially our students, how COVID-19 is taxing and placing demands upon our own resiliency in what we do as professional educators. In a way, COVID-19 has created an experiment in resiliency, and it's really tested how we can prepare and how we can be effective in all that we do, especially teaching. Resiliency has been defined as the ability of people, households, communities, countries, and systems to mitigate, adapt to, and recover from shocks and stresses. And isn't that what we've experienced the last 6 months? Shocks and stresses as we've had to adapt and change and evolve in different ways to the changing conditions of COVID-19. I've heard resiliency referred to as a reservoir, how we need to keep our resiliency reservoir full. When I think of a reservoir, I think of a local reservoir here in Cache Valley that starts out spring being quite full, especially if we've had a good snowpack during the winter time. But as the summer progresses, the level of that reservoir tends to decrease. It tends to go down to the point where you get to fall and it's quite low, sometimes half of what the original water level was. And that reservoir really, it hopes, if you will, that there will be a good winter. It's dependent upon a snowpack over the winter and spring to fill the reservoir back up to make it through another summer. The good news is that for our resiliency in teaching, we don't have to leave it to chance and hope for things like a good snowpack to build our resiliency reservoir and help us to be successful. We have things like the Empowering Teaching Excellence Conference and program. We have our colleagues, we have our families. We have our professions and associations to help us build our reservoirs of resiliency so that we can be effective. I'm very proud of Empowering Teaching Excellence. This year, many of our events and activities, of course, will be virtual. The ETE learning circles and seminars will all be available virtually. ETE is partnering with Aggie's Think Care Act to offer a series of virtual seminars focused on inclusive teaching, and we're excited about that. We have we have ETE activities like our badging program, ETE 10, and again, our learning circles. Reach out, go to the ETE website, explore these many opportunities, including the journal that we have. Once again, to fill your reservoir of resiliency. So as we start fall semester, not only will it be full, in part because you're here today, but then as the semester moves on, conditions may change. Look for opportunities to continue to fill that reservoir of resiliency. The opportunities are there. Take advantage of them. I appreciate the work of our ETE team, our faculty committee. This is truly a faculty-led, faculty-driven program, and the quality of what you're going to experience today and what will be available this coming year is because of the faculty-led initiatives that we have at Utah State University. Let me once again thank you all for the wonderful work that you've been doing in preparing for a fall. I mentioned President Cockett just yesterday how many faculty are attending this conference, and her immediate reaction is something that I echo, how proud we are of our faculty. The work that you are doing, the work that you will be doing this fall. We're in it together. We're part of empowering each other. We're part of teaching excellence together, and together we'll all be resilient for our students. So thank you again for being here. I hope that you have a wonderful conference and a wonderful year. And Marilyn, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Robert. We are so excited to be able to have an incredible professional colleague who was with us at Utah State University and has an amazing background in inclusive teaching. I'd like to just give an overview of Dr. Idalis Villanueva. She's an associate professor at the University of Florida, and she's going to be talking about Más Allá de Horizonte, which is empowering accessible and inclusive learning. Dr. Villanueva is an award-winning faculty researcher who was recently recognized with the Presidential Early Career Award for Scientists and Engineers, and is an NSF Career Award received that in 2016. Idalis teaching interests are focused on entry-level engineering courses that incorporate experiential and social constructivist learning with motivational constructs to form well-rounded engineering professionals. As you're watching her presentation, we encourage you to use the Mighty Networks app to engage with Dr. Villanueva. You will also have an opportunity to put more chat information on the chat area at the bottom. And we encourage you, if you have any questions, that we can continue with our off conference app, Mighty Networks, for any other additional pieces you'd like to talk about. So at this time, I'd like to welcome Dr. Idalis Villanueva.
And I am delighted to be here and be the keynote for this Empowering Teaching Excellence Conference. I wanted to share with you today a little bit about not just what it means to have inclusive and accessible learning, but what does it mean to move beyond the horizon? In Spanish, it said más allá del horizonte. And so that's been the inspiration of today's talk, Más allá del horizonte, empowering accessible and inclusive learning. When I was a little girl, I used to live in Puerto Rico. I grew up and was raised there. And I was very fortunate that I lived right in front of the coast. It was a fisherman's town, and I had the opportunity to look at the horizon every night. And I really enjoyed doing that. I remember sitting in the balcony with my sister and looking at the horizon and seeing these shades of purple and orange and blue and seeing the sun fade down. And every time the sun went away, I knew I had this sense of hope that the sun would come up the next day. And this idea of the horizon in my childhood was very important to me. And that horizon has really expanded in many ways in my life. And currently, that horizon is trying to reach to students and trying to reach to you, educators, and using my experiences and my research and my pedagogy to try to move past that and to reach and connect with different audiences. So this is me. I am the second to the left, surrounded with some of my undergraduate students that have gone on and moved on to much better horizons of their own. But if you need to reach me, I can be reached at i.villanueva@ufl.edu. Going back to this idea of horizons, one of the things that really inspired me growing up was this notion that the horizon expanded beyond the mind. It expanded to the emotional realms, the motivational realms, and whatnot, and even in the arts and music. I remember growing up with this idea that the horizons could represent a dream. It could represent where you came from and where you're headed. And one of the things that always inspired me was this musician composer from Puerto Rico, and in fact, from my hometown of Aguadilla. His name was Rafael Hernandez. And I wanted to share with you today one of his songs. And I decided to put it in Spanish, but I'm quickly going to sort of summarize what that song is about. And it really talks about this idea that you love where you come from, you love the country where you were born, and this innate desire to come back to it, to experience freedom, to experience joy. This is called El Buen Borincano. Sometimes people know it as El Lamento Borincano. And I want you to just take a minute, even if you don't understand necessarily the words, but just listen to the song. This song is from the 30s, and I hope you enjoy it.
Si yo me hubiera nacido en la tierra en que nací, estuviera arrepentido de no haber nacido allí. Yo no tengo la culpita, oigan queridos hermanos, de nacer en esa islita y de ser buen borincano. Como yo no soy de piedra, algún día moriré, y a mi borincana tierra mi despojo le daré. Enterradme donde quiera, pero siempre borinqué. Bolívar en Venezuela, en Cuba soy Martín, y en República Argentina el glorioso San Martín. Y le dieron a Quisqueya, Duarte y Bella Libertad, y a mi tierra borinqueña solo Dios se la dará. Como yo no soy de piedra, algún día moriré, y a mi borincana tierra mi despojo le daré. Enterradme donde quiera, pero si en mi borinqué.
You know, this, even hearing the songs right now, even though this was made in the 1930s, brings a lot of joy into my heart because what it represents is this idea that to seek for a better life, to seek for a better opportunity, sometimes you have to cross the horizons of where you were born, where you were raised, for a better opportunity to then cross back to those horizons to bring something back to your people and to your culture. And so growing up in Puerto Rico, I dreamt of moving past the horizons and the borders of my island to try to get a better life for myself and for my family. And now I use that to try to bring something back to my island. And I feel very honored to be part of that. So when I was a young girl, my father, who was a panadero, panadero is translated to bread baker, really encouraged in us this love for learning. Not having graduated from high school himself, he understood the difficulties that there is in life when you don't have an education and additional means to support yourselves. So he encouraged us for an education, and in the process, I became in love with this idea of engineering, which is what I pursued my bachelor's degree on. But it wasn't without any challenges. I had a lot of barriers for access as an undergraduate student. I was first generation, which meant that I didn't have the institutional or social capital that other students who had parents go through an undergraduate degree had. Um, I experienced a lot of lack of support from faculty during difficult times. A lot of them were very personal challenges. And it just seeing how apathetic many of them were towards my personal issues certainly caused me to question many times why I was pursuing my degree. I was in a very male chauvinist type of culture, so there was a lot of unbelief from family members that a woman could be an engineer. I still remember stories from my grandmother and some of my cousins saying, "Well, why are you doing that? Your job is to stay at home and whatnot." And I remember sort of pushing past those thoughts and continuing to pursue. I also financially did not have the means many times. And there were times where I was food insecure. I had no idea if I had food for the next day or not. I was very fortunate always to have some friends or um, that would help me or activities in the university that allowed me to at least get some food for the day. But that was a real struggle. And these are just some representations of some of the barriers that I went through, but not just me, that students today still go through. These are barriers to access. And I can tell you from having gone through those experiences as a undergraduate student, it really limited my access to learning because sometimes I had to worry about what was my next food for the day rather than studying for an exam. Um, and it really affected my confidence in being able to become the person that I was dreaming to become as I was a student. So let's talk a little bit about accessible learning. Accessible learning, I really like how McKinsey describes accessible learning. Or McKinsey says, there is no one size fits all approach to determining the most effective accommodations for adult learners. And most of our undergraduate students are adult learners, but we sometimes think that we have one type of adult learner when the reality is very different. So, just to highlight some examples of what that might look like, I did a quick search in the US Department of Education, for example, who reported that there are 45 million reported cases. Keep in mind, there might be more because there's a lot of individuals who prefer not to report this. 45 million students who have reported mental, physical, or emotional disability. Or what Pew Research suggests, 6 million students with low socioeconomic status. 3 million who are English language learners, according to the National Center of Education Statistics. And these are just some of the domains and contexts that some of our students bring to the classroom. But if we're thinking about that, if we're thinking that we have individuals who may not have the means to a laptop or to a tablet or to internet access, or where language is a real challenge for them, um, are we really opening that access to our students in the way that we teach, in the way that we teach them? And so I wanted to point you to a framework that many of you may have heard about, and hopefully you have used it in your classes. But if you haven't, I'm going to briefly introduce it, which is this idea of universal design for learning. And this is certainly not a talk about universal design for learning, but I wanted to at least point you to this resource if you haven't explored it. I also want to caution you that oftentimes when you hear the word universal, you usually think of the word like equal, right? Or trying to make it accessible for all. But we want to be careful that in that process, we're also not normalizing the educational experience. And that's certainly not the intent of UDL. In fact, what they are saying is that they want to provide multiple means of engagement, representation, action, and expression. And just to give you a quick overview of what that would look like, for example, if you're looking at engagement, for example, There's certain checkpoints that UDL, if you explore their website and udlguidelines.cas.org, where you can identify different checkpoints that you can achieve in your classes. And it provides some guidance, some examples, and resources that you as an instructor can use for your class. For example, if you were looking at optimizing individual choice and autonomy, um, you may be thinking about things like providing learners with as much autonomy as possible. For example, trying to provide different types of rewards available if they're engaging in a project or an assignment, sequencing certain tasks if you can, allowing learners to participate in the design of classroom activities and academic tasks. Oftentimes, we create a syllabus that's already pre-filled for the students, and we don't consider that maybe there's some expectation or they want to learn about a topic. So maybe leaving a little bit of openness and flexibility for you as an instructor to understand if there is a new topic that they're interested in covering. That might mean a world of difference to the students. The other one is optimizing relevance, value, and integrity. For example, this could be by varying activities, allowing students to personalize their assignments. Maybe you want students to use video and audio or present music as ways to convey some of the information that they learned about a specific topic. Um, for example, minimizing threats and distractions. You can also develop an accepting and supportive classroom climate. And I want to touch on this point very quickly because oftentimes, as instructors, we forget to humanize the learning experience. We forget to show that we are humans to our students. And it's not that you're going to tell them your whole life story, but finding points of connections with the student really makes a big difference. Maybe there's a hobby that you all enjoy, right? That little piece of information that you can provide to a student, or letting them know what it was like to be an undergraduate student, and conveying that you really understand where they're coming from because you had experienced that yourself. Those make a big difference in a student's life. It allows for that motivation and allows for that connection and that mentorship that oftentimes these students need and seek. Varying the social demands for performance, uh, or involving participants in whole class discussions are really important. And I'm going to talk about that later on in this talk. If we look at representation, there's also another set of criteria, such as displaying information in flexible formats, maybe different colors, keeping in mind for individuals who may be colorblind that the colors green and red might not be the best colors to use, or using text equivalents like speech to text recognition or graphics that have also written descriptions. Oftentimes we just put a picture, but is there words on that picture? Not everyone can necessarily appreciate visually the image that you present there, or following accessibility standards. These are all things that you may be able to do in your class. Not that you need to do them all, but finding things that you can offer in your classes is really important. The other one is varying the methods of response and navigation and providing access to assistive technologies. Um, finding alternatives to responding for selections, alternatives, for example, to marking with pen and pencil or alternatives for mouse control. And these are things that your institution can help you and support you on that. But I just wanted to give you an overview of universal design for learning as a potential framework that you could use to assist your students. Now, we've talked about access. I talked a little bit about my undergraduate experience and how these factors, low socioeconomic status, first generation, et cetera, really affected my access to learning. And as you think about it as an instructor, when you're looking at universal design for learning as a whole, what you're really doing is you're opening access. That's equivalent to taking a key and putting it on the right door lock, right? So you put the key there. But the problem is that you can just turn the key, but not push the door and leave it open. And so access in the same vein cannot happen without inclusion. So that's the second point that I want to talk about is inclusive learning. Um, you can't have access and not have inclusive learning as part of it. I really like this quote from Bell Hooks that says, I celebrate teaching that enables transgressions, a movement against and beyond boundaries. It is the movement which makes education the practice of freedom. That really connects with me all the time, that idea that education is a practice of freedom. It's an expansion of that mind. And we as educators have that opportunity to enable that within our classrooms. So I wanted to share a quick experience that I had as an undergraduate. It's more of an indirect experience, but I think that this is very relevant to what we're talking about today. When I was in chemical engineering, I believe it was my junior year of, uh, of my education, and I was taking a class called fluid mechanics. And just to give you a sense of what that class is, it's kind of it's known as a gateway course. It's the first professional chemical engineering course that you take. And if you don't pass that class, normally what happens is that you are pretty much kicked out of engineering and you're encouraged to pursue a different degree. And so there's a lot of stakes in that class in itself. And I remember a fellow student of mine saying, "Hey, would you like to study for this class? I'm feeling very anxious about it. I really don't know how I'm going to do in the class." And I said, "Sure, why not?" So I met with her in her house, and I remember that we set up aside a 3 hour study session, and she all of a sudden lifted up the solution manual and she said, "Okay, I think the professor is going to choose these problems. So let me look at the solution manual. Let me see what problems he might have for the exam and let's practice those." And I looked at her and I said, "Okay, let's do it and let's try it." So we initially tried a problem or two, um, and solution manual looks something like this. And um, I remember that within an hour, she sort of closed the book and was really frustrated and said, "Oh, I can't do this. I can't do this." And I remember sitting back and remembering some of the lessons that my dad taught me, even though he wasn't formally educated in a college environment. He encouraged this idea of really loving your learning and really understanding the concepts behind it. And so I said, why don't we try a different strategy? Why don't we go back to the book and see what are the concepts that are behind some of these problems and see if that would help. So we did that for the next 2 to 3 hours. And I found that her motivation and encouragement was much better than it was before. And that was because she had learned something about her schooling that might have affected the way that she decided to pursue the learning of that. And so I want to make a differentiation between schooling and education because sometimes schooling can get in the way of an education. And so schooling is this idea that from an early age, students learn to game the schooling system. And usually, those that have a little more privilege than other students tend to advance down that system much quicker than others. And so, consequently, students um, of different groups become more concerned with passing rather than learning. Um, this is a problem, especially for minoritized groups who believe that this is the way for success because then the systemic structures that are present further oppresses that learning and they don't experience the freedom that comes with the practice of an education. And so, what is education then? If we look at this again, education, on the other hand, is the center of building human capital and practicing that freedom. It consists of inspiring the mind, not necessarily filling the head with information and details. It incorrectly assumes that for every ounce of teaching, there is an ounce of learning by those who are taught. I think oftentimes instructors make this assumption. Um, and it's a dangerous assumption because then students may be learning or not learning that gaming the system is the way to go rather than really truly learning the concepts that are being taught. And why do I bring that about? Because research has shown that when you think about curriculum as a whole, the curriculum can be divided into several subcategories. And I'm only showing a couple of examples here, but curriculum can be divided into formal curriculum or null curriculum, formal being things that you write, like assignments or syllabi, or written instructions for a project, for example, or null curriculum, which is things that you prefer not to talk about in a classroom, either due to politics or for a for an individual's viewpoint or belief may not be the same as their students. Um, or there's informal, which is things like team projects, after school clubs, activities, and whatnot. And then there's this domain called hidden curriculum, which is what you learn implicitly that is not necessarily tied to the classroom content, but more of what you learn outside the boundaries and the horizons of that classroom. According to the literature, individuals capture more than 80% of the information that they learn from a classroom environment in an unconscious manner. In other words, it's not necessarily what they're learning from the instructor, it's what they're learning about the surroundings of that classroom environment. That could be their peers, that could be the instructors, that could be maybe as part of a department or a college. And according to the model, at least, believe it or not, when you're teaching in a classroom, at least from the instructor side, 50% or more of that is being communicated through body language, through lack of saying certain things, or from even lack of being clear about certain things. So I want to challenge you this semester as you begin thinking about your classes, and especially as many of us may go through online or some form of hybrid teaching. Are we making assumptions that we shouldn't be making in the classroom about where students are at? I want to highlight this a little bit more because I believe that making subtle changes in your classroom, I'm a big believer of small change, something that's manageable and something that's doable. But a small teaching intervention can make a huge difference. Now, I don't claim that I did this work at all, but I want to show you what this researcher at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas did, along with the American Association of Colleges and Universities. So in 2015, they conducted a study of 7 minority serving institutions that had 1,180 students and 35 faculty members. 425 of them were first generation, 402 were non-white, 479 were low income, and 297 were multiracial. And what they asked the instructors to do, the researchers said, all we want you to do is to choose 2 assignments from your class, just 2, and change the instructions of those assignments. Make them clear, make them relevant, and more problem centered. And they asked them to include these 3 things: purpose, criteria, task, and criteria. The first one was purpose. What skills will be learned? And the instructor had to make sure that they answered that question. Or what type of knowledge will be gained? How does the assignment tie to their long-term goals in the profession? The task. What are students expected to do in the assignment, and what are important steps to follow or not follow in that assignment? And then criteria. Was there a checklist or a rubric in advance for students to follow? Is there an example that they provided on what a good assignment looks like? For example, it could be that an instructor provided notes or steps to a similar problem, or they had examples of de-identified assignments from prior students that they wanted to share. And so they did this, and what they found was that if you were looking at this from the perspective of belonging, how well they felt they belonged in this group, and you compared the control groups, which are in gray, versus the treatment groups, which are in black, um, those treatment groups, both for European Americans, which are in the black boxes on your graph on the right, or the African American students, which are in the X's on the graph to the right, we see that the highest gains were found among African American students uh, in terms of their GPA scores from beginning to the end of that semester. Think about that. That's a huge jump, 3.2 to approximately 3.5 in their classes, just by changing the instructions of assignments. So sense of belonging is really important, and being able to clarify some of those expectations to break the barriers of that unconscious and that implicit and bring it back to the explicit is really important. It's important to cross that type of horizon. So sense of belonging is this key that these researchers found to improve persistence, confidence, success for students, but particularly those that were underrepresented. Now, keep in mind that sense of belonging is highly tied to hidden curriculum because hidden curriculum can be communicated verbally, in written form, or even non verbally. So, I just wanted to show you a very quick example of what I'm talking about. So, say you're working on your syllabus for this semester and you decide that you want to talk about cheating and plagiarism. Traditionally, as the example on the left hand side, an instructor will have a written notice or notification that looks something like this. This course will execute a zero tolerance policy on cheating and plagiarism. Seems pretty standard, right? But at the same time, think about it from the perspective of your student. What would they be thinking about when they see that? Are they going to see that this class is going to be a class that is going to support them, even if they make a mistake? Or is this going to be a different type of class? Now, if you were to expand your intentionality of that syllabus, you can do it in a hidden curriculum informed way. And so this is just an example, but let's read it out loud. Regrading of exams, reports, and assignment is a timely and serious undertaking. As such, I take academic integrity very seriously. You're asked to take your academic integrity seriously. I understand that learning new concepts are sometimes challenging and that you may get frustrated. However, before deciding to pursue alternate options, such as cheating, plagiarism, please come see me. I will do my best to help you identify resources in compliance with our code of conduct and help you achieve success. Did you notice a difference? It seems that on one hand, there was no tolerance, no intent to support the student. Whereas on the other hand, not that they were compromising anything in terms of rules and regulations and how they wanted to teach, but there was a different message being conveyed, a message of, yes, you still have to abide to these rules, but I'm here to support you in that process. A very different message that comes from that. So when you think about building inclusion, at least from a hidden curriculum standpoint, make sure that you, as an instructor, are watching out for harmful depictions of, for example, diverse populations from your students. Do you have or have considered including something like that in your syllabus so that you make sure that students know what is appropriate and not in your classroom? If you find an issue in hidden curriculum, ask yourself, is this an issue that affects your one student, one course, one major, or all students? Is this something that's easy, or will it require multiple policies and meetings? If it's an easy thing, then maybe it's something where you address it maybe on a future lesson or on a future assignment. Identify if you can leverage that position that you have, whether you're a faculty, administrator, director of undergraduate studies, for example, to change that hidden curriculum. And always be reflective upon the ideal learning classroom and outcome for your classroom as a whole, clarifying expectations. And are you in that process of clarifying the expectations, making it a more open learning environment? I also wanted to present a different point of view, which is this idea of who's being excluded. And I want to bring to your attention what happened on June 10th of this year, which was the shutdown STEM strike for Black Lives Matter. This was a really interesting event and representation of what's happening in our landscape today. And it makes you wonder who has been excluded from our classrooms. Are we including materials in course materials or references or resources that include a diverse set of voices? Or are we only selecting the primary authors from the majority group without helping students understand or see an example of someone who has gone through that process themselves, that navigation of their education? So think about that this semester. Make sure that the voices of people from different cultures, genders, classes, sexualities, and abilities are heard in the course materials of your class. Reflect, and I can't emphasize this too much, but reflect upon your assumptions as an instructor in the course materials, in your class, and ask yourself how it might affect classroom dynamics. Again, elucidating this example of hidden curriculum. Never assume your audience's gender identity, ability, or sexual orientation. Avoid calling the most commonly seen traits in your context as seen as normal. And assess yourself. Make yourself accountable this semester. I want to challenge you all to do that. If diversity and inclusion is important in your class, then technically you should be able to assess it, right? And so you can ask this question to yourself during the semester. To what extent did the instructor foster a class environment in which diverse points of views were respected? Just want to show you one example of what this might look like. Of course, this book developed by Landis, it's called Start Talking, a handbook for engaging difficult dialogues in higher education, has multiple examples. I just chose one for the purpose of this talk. But this is called the 5-minute rule. And it came from indigenous educators who felt that sometimes the voices of the invisible or marginalized were not being entertained respectfully. And so the idea of this activity is that anyone who feels that a particular point of view is not being taken seriously has the right to point it out or call it in this exercise. So you have individuals taking turns expressing that point of view. And for 5 minutes, everyone has to genuinely consider the merit of that perspective, refrain from criticizing it, and make every effort to believe it. And only those who can speak in support of that perspective are allowed to speak using the questions below as prompts. All critics must remain silent. Keep in mind, this is only 5 minutes. You can always go back to your original viewpoints after that. But the idea is that you're listening, at least entertaining that perspective. And so some of the questions you can ask in this activity are like, what's interesting or helpful about this view? Or what are some intriguing features that others might have not noticed? Or what would be different if you believed this view, if you accepted it as true? And in what sense and under what conditions might this idea be true? According to Landis, this has been a very successful exercise to allow different groups to understand indigenous perspectives in the classroom. And I truly believe that this is an activity that can also be translated to different classrooms and groups as well. The last point I want to make sure that we build upon today is, as you think about inclusion, we need to think about trauma. Um, we have a lot of students, like I showed you before, low socioeconomic status, marginalized, um, that in the past and even now with today's events are experiencing a lot of trauma. And most likely we will have students that have had that trauma being manifested in our classrooms or through assignments and etc. So according to the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Administration, trauma is defined as an event, series of events, or set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and that has a lasting adverse effect on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. And I want to show this video because I think they do a really good job at explaining what's the difference between the learning brain and the survival brain.
Today, I really wanted to think about what's the best way to teach teachers about trauma without getting them distracted with all the technical stuff, and what's the most important thing for them to understand and learn. And I thought that the best way to do it might be to just make a difference between a learning brain versus a brain in survival mode. So we'll just call it learning brain versus survival brain. And this is the difference. So learning brain is this brain that's open to learning new information, and it's completely okay with ambiguity and grays and vagueness, and it sees the big picture. It like pulls back and is on the balcony, can look over the forest and figure out what's going on. On an emotional level, people in learning brain feel calm, peaceful, maybe a little excited about what they're about to learn, maybe a little playful and having fun too, and definitely curious. And they're not afraid of making mistakes because it's just part of the learning process. And so they're not really thinking about themselves. And they actually feel a little bit of confidence that if they just apply themselves, they might pick up what they're trying to learn. Now, survival brain, on the other hand, is completely different. It's hyper-focused on threat. It doesn't like ambiguity. It wants clear, hard facts. It thinks in black and white terms. It doesn't want anything to be gray at all. And then emotionally, you can imagine that survival brain makes people feel panicky, feel like a little obsessive and afraid of getting things wrong. And they don't feel calm and open to learning new things. They just want to get things over with. And people in survival brain also really don't like making mistakes, and they are afraid of looking stupid too. So students in survival brain don't want to be picked on. They don't want to raise their hand and ask questions and look stupid. And so these people are also filled with doubt about their own ability to learn stuff, and they're afraid that other people can see how stupid they really are. Now, it's really important to understand how learning brain and survival brain interact, because survival brain always trumps learning brain. And it makes sense because survival brain is just trying to save your life. And so if it thinks that there's something dangerous happening, you better pay attention to it, right? But the tricky thing is that as survival brain stays on longer and longer, it's harder to get out of that. And it's harder to really go into learning brain. And the way I think about it is kind of like the myth of Sisyphus. You know, that guy who has to push a rock up a hill, and then every day it falls back down and he has to do it over and over again. Well, being in learning brain is like being up on the high parts of that mountain. You can see the expanse of what's going on, but it also takes a lot of work to be up there. And at any second, if you're not paying attention and putting effort into it, it's so easy to slip back into survival brain again. And that rock that Sisyphus is trying to push up, well, that's kind of like stress. And the more stressed you feel, the heavier and bigger that rock gets, and it just pushes you back into survival brain quicker. Now, the kicker is that for traumatized people, stress is a really rigid and intense thing. And so with trauma, any little stress makes that rock grow way bigger than it normally would. And because people with trauma misperceive ambiguous situations as threatening and stressful, that rock just stays big all the time. Now, the good news is that the more you control stress, well, the easier it is to be in learning brain, right? Because that rock is a lot smaller. And what I really want to highlight for teachers is that the best way to keep students in learning brain goes back to why I spent so much time talking about attachment. Students best learn when they feel like they're safe and supported by the adults around them. So it's kind of like a baby elephant. You know how like on those nature shows, the baby elephant is like playing with leaves or exploring a tree or something like that and having a lot of fun. And the only reason why they can do that is because there's a whole group of mama elephants around that baby protecting it and looking out for danger. So a kid with trauma or who's stuck in survival brain, it's kind of like that baby elephant who doesn't have protective adults around them. They can't play and learn because they're way too focused looking out for threat and danger. So this is why I really believe that the most important thing that schools need to focus on, way more important than any kind of techniques or curricula, is really whether or not they are creating that environment where students feel like they're surrounded by these big mama elephants who are going to protect them and watch out for them and make them safe. And when students have that, I bet you it unlocks their curiosity, their eagerness to learn, and play as a way to learn. So I hope that's helpful. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments below. Thanks.
So I thought this was a really good illustration. And, of course, you might think that this is for the younger kids, but really, if you think about what neuroscience suggests, there's malleability in the brain, even in the mid 20s to early 30s, still happening with human beings. So we are very much dealing with an age group that needs to have a supportive learning environment. And as it was suggested in the video, trauma can have serious consequences to learning because it reroutes the brain's resources away from executive functions like focus, concentration, time management, and decision making, all of which affect learning. Um, and so I wanted to give you a couple of pointers for this. Certainly there's a lot more than that in available online, but I just wanted to sort of share some of them with you. 5 points. One of them is when you're thinking about trauma aware and making sure that you are a trauma aware instructor, the first one is treating your students with respect. You know, it's good to have high expectations for your students and to challenge them, but you can't do that without balancing that challenge with support, right? Pointing to students to campus mental health resources, putting it first and in the forefront of your syllabus, for example, is a way to do that. Giving students choice whenever possible. For example, offering students to respond in different ways, maybe via text, maybe you create a Google Voice for the class that they can use to communicate with you, or a teaching assistant, or audio or video. Maybe they can share their assignments in that way because maybe there's challenges with writing or using keyboards. Again, going back to this idea of universal design for learning. As you think about your online courses or hybrid courses, or if you're deciding whether to do Zoom meeting, um, I encourage you to think about what it means to force students to be on camera. You are opening up access to this world that you may not know about your student. And in that process, you may not know if there are some traumatizing experiences that are on the backdrop of that student's um, camera that may expose them to social media bullying, right? So, have you really thought about what it means to do that? And can you find ways via Zoom or other platforms to try to minimize that if you decide to have students be on camera? Present yourself as a human first and a teacher second. Oftentimes we flip this around, and it's really important to do it backwards because humanizing your learning allows students to connect with you. And in that process of connection, they'll feel care and support in that learning environment. And if you suspect that there might be signs of trauma that you see in your students, when appropriate, and let me disclose that when appropriate, follow up with a private email, be kind, direct, empathetic, but don't try to counsel your students. There are experts in campus that can do that for you. But a simple, I'm sorry to hear that. I wanted to check on you. Is there anything I can do to help? Is really effective and appropriate, and it will show students how much you care. And then pointing them with resources is the next follow up to that. So as you think about the horizons being, in this case, your classroom, I want you to reflect on this quote. I thought this was very interesting. Um, it says, if you have come to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let's work together. And this is really important because, like I said before, education is the practice of freedom, not just for the learner, but for the instructor as well. So as you begin to construct your courses this semester, reflect upon this quote and expand the horizons of your mind. Ask yourself how your role as an instructor can help liberate you as well as your learners. It starts with reflection, intentionality, and action. Gracias. Thank you for listening to this talk. And if you have any additional questions, you can find me in my email or through Twitter or my LinkedIn account. Um, Thank you so much for being part of this and for opening those horizons of your mind today. Have a wonderful day.
And I'll be sending our own thank you out to Dr. Villanueva for that. It's a perfect time for our conference theme to be discussed, and she gave us some extremely relevant areas that we can use in our classroom. Thank you so much for participating also on the Mighty Networks app, as Dr. Villanueva is going to be on there, and she can take your real-time questions. If you, again, are wondering, where do I find it? It's located on the upper right-hand side of our main conference schedule page. You can click on that. You can join on a web browser or on your phone, your smartphone. And I really would like for you, if you haven't had a chance, join our network so you can also follow presenters and see what other people are talking about. Travis is also going to continue to ask if you have any questions or anything. You can also ask us on the Mighty Networks app, and we are all on there, and we'll get right back to her. At this time, I always want to say we are a part of networking. We may not be able to touch each other, but we can reach out to each other on the Mighty Network app, and I encourage you to reach out to your colleagues, and we're seeing some excellent comments that are happening now. So Travis, I'll turn it back to you. Thank you. You're muted.
That
was our
right.
That was our first mistake, wasn't it?
Let me try that again. Thank you so much, Marilyn, for the work that you've put in to put this together. And we're really grateful for Dr. Villanueva for that amazing keynote to get us started today. I just want to take 1 minute real fast and show everyone the best way to navigate the conference is by going to this full schedule tab. And you'll be able to see all of the different sessions. So for example, our next concurrent sessions that will be starting at 10:15 Mountain Time are organized by the tracks in which they're being presented. So each session has one of those assigned tracks. And for example, if you want to attend one of these sessions, you will click just to view the session, and then you'll be able to find that session link there on that page, along with the information about the session and the presenter. We have emailed out the passwords. We're trying to keep those limited to our attendees. So if you can't find the password, please feel free to email me at travis.thurston@usu.edu. Also, we have posted those on the app as well. So as Marilyn said, we would really encourage you to join us on the app. That's where we're having kind of our ongoing conversation and engagement during the conference. And so if you haven't already connected on the app, you can access it with this button at the top of the web page, Access Mobile App, and that will link you over there. I also want to just quickly point out that Dr. Villanueva will be on our app on Mighty Networks answering some of your questions. So please feel free to direct some questions specifically to her. And again, engage with the other presenters, other participants in the app. This space is for you to engage, share resources, share your insights and your expertise. And it's a great space for us to build this community together. So with that, Marilyn, we'll go ahead and close out our opening session. And any final words?
Just remember that you have that main conference schedule. And if you have any questions or you're wondering what does this all mean, we have a map that's also been created, and it will give you an opportunity to kind of like walking around. If we would have had buildings, these are like virtual areas. So you can go through, you say the keynote, we'll link back to the breakout sessions. That's where we're going next. We'll have a morning wrap up. And it all goes back to the same area. So some of us like being inclusive, as Dr. Villanueva said, having different opportunities to see how things work. And this is a wonderful area that we've created and made sure that we have it as also a visual. Thank you again. The Zoom passwords. Travis, we have a question that's very important. How do we get in those Zoom rooms and their breakout sessions? Can we go over that one more time?
Yep, I'd be happy to. So if you navigate,
You're muted.
Of course I'm muted.
Okay. L. Lundgren said that he emailed them out last night. Great. Thank you, Travis, for doing that. So again, those Zoom passwords are going to be in an email. If you go to your next session, which are the morning sessions, you've got 4 different tracks you can go through, and those are going to be tracks that we have created as live areas. So again, thank you so much for coming. Concurrent session A starts at 10:15.